good.
Okay, it's recording.
So, you've told us now about trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Hard trauma, we call it, soft trauma, everyday life that we can all recognize,
Right.
that Joe the plumber could recognize.
Right.
And varying things that happen. So what's your story? I see David Berceli.
Right.
Beautiful. Berceli. And Ph.D.
Yes.
So what's your story? Is it in history of meat cutting, your Ph.D.? Sociology?
Actually, my Ph.D. is in clinical social work.
Right.
And what happened was that I was living in Lebanon many years ago when Lebanon was experiencing a lot of severe fighting and bombing. Right. And I had become traumatized without knowing what it was, because back in the 70s it wasn't that familiar yet in most clinical settings. And so when I came back to the United States, I went to counseling for 2 years, and I discovered that I understood everything that happened to me. But I told the therapist, I said, I'm still sick. There's still something wrong. I don't understand it. But I understand everything that happened to me. Why do I not feel better?
Right.
And so her suggestion was, well, maybe you need to do some sort of body therapy. It was just a general sort of thing.
Right.
So I took her up on it sort of seriously. And living in New York at the time, there were all types of body therapies. And so I went to everything I could experience, just so I could see what are they like, what do they do, what parts of these different types of body therapies, if any of them, would be useful for me. Through that, I put together a whole bunch of different things and realized somehow my body was affected in war. I knew that. I wasn't exactly sure how it was affected in war, but I did know something happened. I also knew that my belief system, which we've just talked about, was somehow shattered. I didn't understand, why did this happen? Why did it happen to me? What does this mean about people and about life and about God and all those questions? And so I got a degree in theology because I wanted to understand what does spirituality mean? What does belief system in God mean? Because I wanted to know why mine was broken. I didn't understand it. So I had my degree in theology, I had my degree in social work, and I got licensed in a form of body therapy called bioenergetic analysis, which is a form of body psychotherapy. And with all of that, I went back to the Middle East again and went back into war and allowed myself kind of to get traumatized again. And then through that process, I began to work out, what did that just do to my body? What did it do to the way I think? What did it do to the way I believe? And through a series of sort of hits and misses and accidents and self-planning, I began to figure out what was going on in me, and I tried to do it in a holistic way, not to use an overused term, but it was a way to help me figure out what happened to me. When I began to work with that, I began to then use some of those same techniques that I was looking at within myself with friends. And I began to piece together a process that helped the individual begin to heal these fractured places in their lives that were both in their psyche, in their body, and in their belief system of some sort. And so through that process, I was then given the challenge of not doing what we would do in the Western world, where I would work one-on-one with an individual. I was living in a country that had 1 million traumatized people, and I worked with hundreds. And so the question was, what can I do to find a method that would help traumatized people learn how to heal themselves without needing the aid of a professional therapist? Because in most of these countries, they don't have it. So I ended up moving to other countries in Africa and the Middle East where there was still war or political violence, so there was still severe trauma. So I continued to work with whole populations of traumatized people and began to develop a method in trauma recovery that allowed the person to actually do a series of exercises, just 6 exercises, that began to evoke in them a releasing mechanism that allowed them to heal some of the deep tensions that were being created by their traumatic experiences. In that process, they actually began to get better psychologically, and they actually began to find a way to rebuild a belief system. So I discovered that actually working from a body place, which is the only thing these people had in their country, because there was no therapist, there was no spiritual director, They didn't have anybody to guide them, so it had to be some kind of self-help method.
Yeah.
And that's how I came up with these trauma releasing exercises.
We also know in some of these cultures there can be a stigma against about sitting down with a
Very
shrink,
much so, yeah.
which can be well founded because a lot of shrinks, have their own power stuff.
Right, right.
Would you think, I'm guessing now, that if you start, not you can start in one place, you start with the body, then maybe the cognitive system follows better than if you start with the cognitive system?
Well, this is what I've discovered. I've worked in 27 countries, and so I've worked with lots of different peoples and cultures and languages, and I discovered that every person has some access point that they can start in terms of healing their trauma.
Right.
Some people feel more comfortable starting with the mind or starting with psychology because it's a place they feel safer.
Yeah.
Others don't feel safe there. Some people will feel much safer beginning with their body and just doing exercises.
Right.
And if that's their access point, that's where they need to begin. Other people who might belong to a community of believers will start with their belief system first and say, well, I believe God did this or did that. But what I've discovered is that no matter which starting point they use, it always leads to one of the other sections. So you could start with spirituality, but it's going to lead you to the body and the mind. Excuse me. Or you could start with the body, which will lead you to the psychology and spirituality.
Right.
Or you can start with psychology, it'll lead you to the body. The reason for that is that no matter how you want to believe, we already know through science there is no separation between the mind and the body. That does not exist. It was great that we separated to try to understand the two of them, but they don't exist in reality as separate entities. So your mind and your body and your sense of belief about life all coexist together. You cannot affect one without affecting the other. And so